So, did we evolve from Homo erectus? The short answer is yes, probably, but it's not that simple. It's not a straight line. The story of human evolution isn't a neat ladder with one species turning into the next. It's more like a messy branching bush, and Homo erectus is a huge, thick trunk on that bush, the one most of the later branches, including our own, sprouted from. To really get it, we need to meet this ancient relative, understand their world, and then see how the puzzle pieces of the fossil record fit together. Let's start with who they were. Homo erectus means upright man. They were a species of early human that lived for an incredibly long time. Their story starts in Africa around 2 million years ago, and they only disappear from the fossil record a couple 100,000 years ago. Think about that. 2 million years. Our own species, Homo sapiens, has only been around for about 300,000 years. Homo erectus was a massive success story. They were survivors, and they were pioneers. They were the first of our ancestors to walk out of Africa and spread across the globe. And we find their fossils and their tools all over the place, from Africa to the country of Georgia, all the way to China, Indonesia, and Asia. They were the original world travelers. What did they look like? If you could see one, you'd recognize them as human, but different. They were the first of our relatives to have truly human-like body proportions. They had long legs and shorter arms, built for walking and running long distances across the savannah. They were tall and lean. One of the most famous Homo erectus skeletons ever found is a young boy from Kenya called Turkana Boy. He was probably only about 8 years old when he died, but he was already over 5 feet tall. As an adult, he might have reached 6 feet, so these weren't short, stooped creatures. They stood tall. Their heads were different from ours, though. They had a long, low skull with a thick brow ridge that jutted out over their eyes. Their faces were flatter than earlier hominins, but they didn't have the prominent chin that we do. And their brains were bigger than those of their predecessors, like Homo habilis. Not as big as ours, but getting there. An early Homo erectus had a brain around 600 cubic centimeters, but over their long existence, that size grew to over 1,000 cubic centimeters. For comparison, our brains are typically between 1,200 and 1,400. That brain growth is a big deal. It tells us something was changing, they were getting smarter, we can see that intelligence in the things they left behind. Their tools. Homo erectus is famous for making a tool called the Acheulean hand axe. It might not sound like much, but it was a revolutionary piece of technology. It was a teardrop-shaped stone, carefully flaked on both sides to create a sharp edge all around. It was a multi-tool. You could use it to butcher an animal, chop wood, or dig for roots. Making one wasn't easy. You had to know which rocks to pick. You had to have a plan in your head of the shape you wanted to make. You needed skill and patience to flake it just right. The design was so good, so effective, that they kept making them in pretty much the same way for over 1 million years. It was the longest-lasting tool tradition in human history. They were also likely the first to control fire. The evidence is tricky. It's hard to tell if a patch of burnt earth is from a natural wildfire or a controlled hearth. But at sites in Israel and South Africa, there's good evidence of controlled fire from nearly 1 million years ago. Fire changed everything. It provided warmth, protection from predators at night, and a new way to get food. Where cooking food makes it easier to digest and unlocks more calories. More calories means you can fuel a bigger, more energy-hungry brain. Fire may have literally fueled our own evolution. So this was Homo erectus, a tall, long-legged, world-traveling, tool-making, fire-using hominin with a growing brain. They were a new kind of human, one that was adaptable and resilient. They set the stage for everything that came after. Now, let's get back to the main question. Are they our direct ancestors? For a long time, the picture seemed pretty clear. The story went something like this. A small-brained ape like ancestor Australopithecus gave rise to the first toolmaker, Homo habilis. Then Homo habilis evolved into the bigger, smarter Homo erectus. Homo erectus then spread out of Africa. The ones who stayed in Africa eventually evolved into us, Homo sapiens. The ones in Europe evolved into Neanderthals. It was a nice, clean line, a ladder of progress. This is the version many of us learned in school. And it's not entirely wrong, it's just too simple. The real story is much messier and honestly much more interesting. The first complication is geography. Remember how Homo erectus spread all over the old world? This created different populations separated by vast distances. The ones in Indonesia were living in a very different environment from the ones in Georgia or the ones back in East Africa. Over hundreds of thousands of years, these populations would have started to look a little different from each other. They adapted to their local environments. Some scientists even think the African and Asian populations were different enough to be called separate species. They called the African version Homo ergaster, working man, and reserved the name Homo erectus for the Asian populations. In this view, Homo ergaster in Africa is our direct ancestor, and the Asian Homo erectus was a side branch that eventually went extinct. Other scientists say the differences aren't that big. They argue they were all one widespread variable species, Homo erectus. For our story, this detail is important. Whether you call them ergaster or erectus, our lineage almost certainly comes from the African branch. The genetic evidence is very clear on this point. All modern humans trace their ancestry back to a population that lived in Africa relatively recently. So, we are not descended from the famous Peking man fossils in China or the Java man fossils in Indonesia. Those were likely evolutionary dead ends. They were our cousins, not our direct grandparents. So the answer gets a bit more specific. We likely evolved from an African population of Homo erectus. That already complicates the simple yes, but there's another layer of complexity. It's what scientists call the muddle in the middle. This refers to the period between about 800,000 and 300,000 years ago. The fossil record from this time is confusing. We start seeing hominins that don't look quite like classic Homo erectus anymore, but they don't look like modern humans or Neanderthals either. They're somewhere in between. These fossils have been given another name, Homo heidelbergensis. They were found first near Heidelberg, Germany, but later fossils were found in Africa and other parts of Europe. They had bigger brains than Homo erectus, closer to our own size. Their skulls were still robust, but they were starting to look a bit more modern. So, where does Homo heidelbergensis fit in? The most common view is that they evolved from Homo erectus in Africa. They were the next step. Then, one population of Homo heidelbergensis spread out into Europe and Asia. The ones in Europe eventually evolved into Neanderthals. The ones who stayed behind in Africa eventually evolved into us, Homo sapiens. In this scenario, Homo erectus is still our ancestor, but they are our great-great-great-grandparent, not our direct parent. They are the ancestor of Homo heidelbergensis, who is then our ancestor. It adds a step to the ladder. It makes the connection indirect, but it's still there. Homo erectus is the rootstock. This is probably the most widely accepted story right now. It makes a lot of sense with the fossil evidence we have. The timeline works, the geography works, the anatomical changes from erectus to heidelbergensis to sapiens show a clear, gradual transition. We see the brain getting bigger, we see the face getting flatter, we see the tools getting more sophisticated. But even this story isn't the full picture. The world of our ancestors was complicated. It wasn't just one species, neatly replacing another. Recent discoveries, especially from genetics, have shown that different groups of hominins were living at the same time and even interbreeding. We know that our Homo sapiens ancestors met and had children with Neanderthals after they left Africa. Many people of European and Asian descent carry a small amount of Neanderthal DNA in their genomes today. We also know they interbred with another mysterious group called the Denisovans, known only from a few small fossils from a cave in Siberia. People in parts of Asia and Oceania carry Denisovan DNA. This tells us that the human family tree is not a tree with cleanly separated branches. It's more like a tangled, thorny bush where the branches sometimes grow back into each other. So what does this mean for Homo erectus? It's possible that some very late surviving populations of Homo erectus were still around when other, more modern-looking humans were on the scene. On the Indonesian island of Flores, there was a tiny species of human nicknamed the hobbit Homo floresiensis that lived until as recently as 50,000 years ago. They are thought to have descended from an early population of Homo erectus that got stranded on the island and shrank in size. For a time, they shared the planet with us. In China, there are some fossils from the muddle in the middle that are hard to place. They have a mix of features, some that look like Homo erectus, some that look like Homo sapiens. This has led some scientists to suggest that there might have been some interbreeding between our direct ancestors and late surviving erectus populations in Asia. The evidence for this is not strong yet, but it's a possibility. It highlights a fundamental problem. When we draw these neat lines and give every new fossil a different species name, we might be creating a false sense of separation. And evolution is a continuous process. Where does one species end and the next begin? Imagine a long line of family photos stretching back millions of years. You could stand next to your mother and see the resemblance. she could stand next to her mother. But if you took your photo and put it next to your ancestor from 1 million years ago, the difference would be enormous. There's no single generation where the child was a different species from the parent. So maybe the question itself is a bit flawed. Maybe we shouldn't think of Homo erectus as a discrete box that we either came from or didn't. Maybe it's better to think of them as the long foundational phase of human evolution. They were the ones who established the human body plan. They were the ones who pushed the boundaries of the human world. They were the template. For over 1.5 million years, there was a widespread, adaptable, intelligent hominin we call Homo erectus. Over time, in different parts of the world, they changed. In Africa, they changed in a direction that eventually led to us. The changes were slow, gradual. The brain got bigger. The skull got rounder. The brow ridge shrank. New ideas and new technologies, like better tools and more complex hunting strategies, emerged. At what point do we stop calling them Homo erectus and start calling them Homo heidelbergensis? At what point do we stop calling them Homo heidelbergensis and start calling them early Homo sapiens? These are lines that scientists draw for convenience, to make sense of a messy fossil record. But they are not hard, solid boundaries, so let's try to put it all together. Did we evolve from Homo erectus? Yes. In the grand sense, they are our ancestors. The very foundation of our lineage is built on the biological and cultural innovations of Homo erectus. Without their success, their expansion out of Africa, their larger brains, and their increasingly complex tools, the story of later humans, including us, would not have happened. They are the trunk of our family tree, but the connection is not a simple direct line from any Homo erectus anywhere in the world to us. Our specific lineage comes from a specific place, Africa. The populations of Homo erectus in Asia were our distant cousins, not our direct ancestors. They represent a different branch of the human story, one that eventually ended. And the connection is probably not direct, but mediated through an intermediate species, Homo heidelbergensis. So, Homo erectus is more like our ancestral species, the stock from which our more immediate ancestors arose. They are the grandparents, not the parents. The best way to think about it is this, like around 2 million years ago, a new kind of human emerged in Africa. We call them Homo erectus. They were incredibly successful. They spread far and wide. One branch of their family, the one that stayed in Africa, continued to evolve. Their brains grew larger, their technology improved. Over hundreds of thousands of years, they transformed. We can call this later form Homo heidelbergensis. Then, one population of these African heidelbergensis continued to change, their skulls becoming lighter, their faces tucking in under their foreheads, their chins emerging. This was the birth of our species, Homo sapiens. So, when you ask if we evolved from Homo erectus, the answer is a resounding yes, but it's complicated. They are not just a fossil in a museum. They are a deep part of our story. Their legacy is in our long legs built for walking across continents. It's in our appetite for calories to feed our big brains, an appetite first seriously catered to by the control of fire. It's in our impulse to explore, to see what's over the next hill, an impulse that first took our family out of its African homeland. The story of our origins isn't a simple march of progress. It's a sprawling family saga, with branches that thrived, branches that withered, and cousins we are only just getting to know through scraps of bone and whispers in our DNA. And Homo erectus stands at the beginning of it all, the great ancient patriarch of the human journey. They are us, in a deep and ancient way, and we are them, just a few million years down the road.